that Nate and I are putting on a wrestling exhibition this afternoon out on the front lawn.
Let me serve you.
I'm the one that's doing that. I should, my son, we have the two grandchildren, and they're all boy, and by the way, we call them our miracle grandchildren, because they were born at 25 weeks and weighed 1.5 pounds. I'm not sure, so they fit in your hand. They were premature babies, and but they've grown up into healthy boys, and so we were visiting them recently, and my one, I think it was Leo, says to Ronan, their names are Leo and Ronan, and Leo goes, "I'm going to take you down." And he just looks at and he swings at it. And they're good boys, right? So what my son does is that he says, "Okay, guys," he said, "I want you in this corner and this corner." He said, "We're going to wrestle it out." And he says, "What are the rules? No biting and no kicking." And he says, "And what do you do? If you want to quit, I hit my hand on the floor, Dad." And he says, "Okay. When I yell, go, you go." And they go, and then they have fun. He turned it into something fun, as a way to defray the anger that they felt with one another. And so I always kid Nate, as you know, Nate was a former wrestler, and that obviously he would break my bones. So. All right, well, let's try to summarize where we are. Again, in planning this with Andrew, that they wanted us to come and provide some principles, some teaching, and some resources and tools for you to use in building disciple-making churches. And really, and I know there's a variety of ministries here, that you can use whatever ministry context that God has placed you in. And so the idea of a triad is one of these ministry tools or forms that could be applicable in your setting. And for example, as to a curriculum, I was talking with Moses, I've used the Every Man a Warrior books with men, and I know Donnie has. They really work well in a triad or a quad, or something like the Navigators 2-7 series. Some of you may be familiar with that. Those are some really good pieces, and I know there's other curriculums out there. They're really ones that are really tailor-made for a triad or a quad experience. And so that we're walking through, this illustration. We talked yesterday about building a heart, a heart for God. We spent the session on. Donnie led us in building relationships. Tom led us into developing a picture of a disciple. And this morning, I'm going to talk about the discovery side, how to ask questions. And later in the morning, after coffee tea break, Tom's going to talk about application, accountability, and affirmation. So again, we want to give you some tools and some principles that you can take and kind of apply to your setting. Now, to talk about, this is going to be a fun session because, again, in every culture, there's a different way of looking at discovery, questions, and so on. But let me introduce this in this way, that, and this is a true story, we do have a dog named Ginger, all right? I don't know if you have coonhounds in Africa. She's a coonhound, and so she's a hunting dog. And as I shared the other day with the one group, before Peggy retired, she'd go to work during the day, and in my case, as a navigator, I had my office was at home. And so I'd be in and out of the home, obviously, seeing people, but sometimes you're staying more at home, doing telephone calls and so on. So I had a slow navigator day, and Peggy's off at her work, her job, and I decided that day I was going to teach Ginger how to whistle. Ginger really is a smart dog. She figured out how to unlock our gate to the backyard and get out and run around the neighborhood. I figured any dog that can unlock a gate can learn how to whistle. So I spent the day helping Ginger learn how to whistle. So when Peggy came home at the end of the day, she said, "Well, what did you do today?" I said, "Well, I taught Ginger how to whistle." And so she kind of bends down and waits for a minute. She says, "I don't hear him whistling." And I said, "Well, I said I taught her. I didn't say she learned it." And so do we have any teachers in the crowd, professional teachers? So what's the difference here? What's the difference between teaching and learning? Sometimes. It's not a true story. That's a quick way to lose credibility. So what's the difference here between teaching and learning sometimes? Yes, ma'am.
Teaching is you pass on information,
Uh-huh.
but when you learn, there has to be a measurable change of behavior.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, so if you've learned something, there's a measurable change or behavior, and obviously Ginger didn't demonstrate that. Yeah. Any other thoughts just from that little example here about teaching and learning? Yes, sir.
Yeah, teaching is just providing knowledge, and I would say that learning is more of the application.
Okay, yeah. The teaching can be the acquisition of knowledge, and then learning is kind of the application of it, the measurable behavior and so on. And there's a great statement, and it's not original to me. And I want to get your comments on this. The statement is that telling is not teaching and listening is not learning. How do you respond to that? Telling is not teaching and listening is not learning. How do you react to that? What's that saying about the teaching-learning process? Telling is not teaching and listening is not learning.
There has to be engagement.
Excuse me?
There has to be some engagement.
Ah.
Telling is devoid
Okay.
of the person.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So telling is devoid. There's no engagement. Just telling only. Yes. Any other thoughts, reactions?
Telling is also like only one way.
Okay.
Just saying to someone.
Yes.
But there's no feedback, getting back what the person
Yes.
has had and how they perceive what you're telling them.
Yes. Yeah. So the telling is more one way. And so again, the idea of engagement is no feedback. Yeah. Any other thoughts, reactions to that statement? Yes.
Listening is also not learning because
Yes.
you know if a person they listened and learned by what they do with what they had.
Okay. Yes.
Yes, so there has to be more than just listening.
Okay.
The same thing, action.
Yes. Yes. And so if I've truly listened, hopefully there'll be some action from it. But that's not always a guarantee, is there? Yeah, then I'm going to do something on this. That I was joking, by the way, and I know all of you are teachers and all of you have been in front of groups. And generally you can tell when people are not listening, even though their eyes are directed at you. And I could tell that the other day when Valerie was falling asleep on one of my sessions. No, I don't mean to pick on Valerie. We were all exhausted after this. But right, you can see in the audience. We call it in America the deer in the headlights look, and you know the people aren't engaged. And so just because I'm listening doesn't mean I'm necessarily learning. There's gonna be a whole lot of other stuff going on in my head. And because I tell something doesn't always mean that I've taught. And so what I'd like to do this morning a little bit is to reverse the dance. And particularly in a Western culture, American culture, dance is often the traditional form of dancing was ballroom dancing. If you're familiar with ballroom dancing, you have a partner, and you're dancing around. And in ballroom dancing, there's a leader. Traditionally, it's a man that leads, and the woman follows as they dance. And so that in teaching, oftentimes the teacher is the leader. He or she is kind of controlling the curriculum, making the movements and so on, and the learner follows. And what I'd like to suggest this morning a little bit is that we're going to reverse the partners. And how do I think if I let the learner lead instead of me, the teacher, leading? And the way to allow the learner to lead is by asking questions and by encouraging discovery. And to do that, let me illustrate, I hope I got another piece of paper left, is to think about Jesus' teaching ministry. Okay, we'll kind of do a continuum here. What I'd like to suggest on the one end of Jesus' teaching ministry is that it was very formal. All right, he was a good rabbi. The other end is it was also informal. And Jesus went across the spectrum as a teacher. And so in the formal end, he did have messages. Boy, we have the Sermon on the Mount, there's a variety of messages. And he taught in a formal way, didn't he? Also, what else did he do? He told stories. And we call them parables. And he engaged people in those stories and he taught them. And also he used, this is a little bit different perhaps, metaphors or analogies. So an analogy, you're comparing one thing to another. He would say the kingdom of heaven is like, and we could all fill it in, right? It's like a mustard seed, and we got a whole variety of things. And that, so he's teaching through analogies, or he uses metaphors. I am the bread of life. I am the good shepherd. Now, we know that he's not literally a piece of bread, right? Or I'm the vine. Now, we know he's not literally a vine, but he's teaching us because he's taking something that is a solid image, like a vine, a piece of bread, but then he's asking us to kind of massage it and think about it, because what does he mean by being the bread of life? He's not literally a piece of bread, but he's using something solid to engage us in the learning process. Because when he says that I'm the bread of life, and I realize he's not a piece of bread, so what am I then prompted to do? Prompted to think about it. What in the world does he mean by being a piece of bread? And so he's engaging me. He's using a metaphor or an analogy. It's the same thing like the kingdom of heaven is like a grain, mustard seed. What in the world does he mean by that? See what he's doing? He's engaging me in the learning process. So he's using metaphors. What else does he do? He gave assignments, right? He sent the 12 out. He sent the 70 out. And if you notice in those gospel records, they come back and they talk about it. He gave them assignments. And lastly, I'd like to suggest is that he asked a whole lot of questions. There's over 300 questions recorded in the Gospels, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And so what Jesus did is that he blended the formal with the informal, right? As to what was appropriate for his audience. Well, one other thing. In here, he also did small group stuff. Now, in one sense, the disciples were a small group, but remember, I think it's in Mark 5, after he teaches, gives some parables, and then he pulls the 12 aside, and he instructs them on what the parables mean. And so he used small groups, shifting more towards the informal, to interact with them so they can understand what he's talking about. Now, let me use the illustration this way, that, I don't know, do you have, in the U.S., we used to have an old children's playground called a teeter-totter. I don't know, maybe there's another, it's like you have a fulcrum and you have a, is that?
Yeah.
What's that called here? It's a
Seesaw.
seesaw, yes, it's a seesaw. Yes. And so that, and if you got on the seesaw as a little kid, if, the other child on the other end was a bit of the plus size, somebody like me, I could hold it down, right? And so, I'm holding it down and the other kid's up here, dangling in midair, right? And I would like to suggest that oftentimes in the church, if you take this, if you get the seesaw, but the church puts a heavy weight over here, doesn't it? And there's nothing wrong with that. Jesus did all of this, right? And all of this is important. We need to be in places of instruction and teaching. But we need to have the whole gamut to what Jesus is doing. And so I like to suggest that the seesaw needs to go up and down rather than being stuck. Because if I stayed only over here, the reality is I just can't question myself to find out what God's like. I need some instruction on what God is like, right? So I need to have teaching. And so the seesaw needs to go up and down. Does that make sense? Between the formal and the informal. And when we talk about disciple making in particular, because we're doing this 1-to-1, 1-to-2, 1-to-3, I'd like to suggest that we put a greater emphasis on the informal. And this is why people need to be engaged in a local church. Hopefully the pastor, right? My friend back there is doing a good job at giving good solid teaching. But the informal side is often done 1-to-1, 1-to-2, 1-to-3. And what we want to focus on in this time is this element of asking questions as a teaching tool to engage the learner. So let me stop. Any comments on this? Any thoughts? Debates? Reactions? So this is where we're going this morning in my time, is we're going to talk about the role of questions. You know, and I found this interesting discovery. The 5th century African leader, St. Augustine. Now we know, Augustine was African. And so in his congregation, it's recorded that when he's preaching, that people would stand up and argue with him. They would stand up and affirm him. They would stand. So it's this, even as a preacher, he has this ongoing dialogue, conversation, engagement with all these people. I thought, that must have been a wild place. And particularly some of you, if you've ever read anything of St. Augustine, it's hard to debate this guy. And yet his congregation was astute enough, and they were engaged and involved with him. And so that we want to engage people by asking questions. And I'm going to give you a tool this morning that will help you to do that. And I realize that in some cultures and in some settings, there's a greater sensitivity to asking questions, and perhaps a sensitivity as to the types of questions. And so again, today, it's like what Nate's emphasized as well. This is some of the things we've learned. You need to think through your context and your relationships to see how these would be applicable. All right, so on your note page, which is back in the back, I'm going to kind of really vary from this on the way of discovery, but let me just make a couple of observations. And I forgot to bring my Bible with me. And yeah, I know where everything is in mine. So that the way of discovery is about asking questions, and it's fascinating. I like to suggest that asking questions started in the garden. Because in Genesis 3:9, this is a record of the first, now again, this is a record. I don't know if there have been other conversations, but this is the first record of a conversation that God is having with Adam and Eve. So in Genesis 3:9, what happens here? It says, but the Lord called to the man and said to him, where are you? So what's the first thing? This is a first recorded conversation God has with Adam and Eve, and what's he doing? He's asking a question. Where are you? Then in verse 11, he said, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree in which I commanded you not to eat? Second encounter. He's asking another question of Adam and Eve. Then in verse 13, well, that was just 13. Yeah, verse 11. 13 says, then the Lord God said to the woman, what is this that you have done? He's asking another question. Okay, now, God obviously knew what was going on, right?
Yeah.
And so why do you think that God is asking questions of Adam and Eve rather than making statements? Why do you think God's asking questions of Adam and Eve rather than just making statements? Particularly since it's not because he doesn't know something. He's not asking questions to gain knowledge. So what do you think is the purpose behind his questions? Yes, ma'am.
What he wants to achieve. So
Okay.
if he makes statements, it's like judgment.
Okay.
So that curtails the conversation, kind of.
Uh-huh.
The defensive.
Okay.
It can touch their defense.
Yes.
When you ask questions, you begin to probe and allow them to open up and like for them to own up to
Okay. Yes. Yeah. It appears that he can make the judgment. Now later on he makes a judgment, but initially, and I like what you said, he's forcing them to own up to what had happened. Any other thoughts? Because again, he knew this. He knew what they had done. It didn't surprise him. So yes, sir.
I see that questions help someone to bring out the reality of something that happened.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it brings out the reality? Yes, of something that happened. Yeah, that's a great way of phrasing it. Yes.
Yeah,
Any other thoughts? Yes.
yeah, I think just another self-discovery.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he wanted them to discover by themselves,
Yes.
not him telling them this
Yes.
is what you have done.
Yes. Let me, let's explore that, because that's a great, so there's an element of self-discovery here. And so, what does self-discovery do? A friend here, you said self-discovery helps me to own something. What else does self-discovery do? What other things can self-discovery do? Yes, ma'am.
give somebody personal responsibility.
Yes. Yeah, that's the idea. Again, it's another way of stating, yeah, I'm owning it. So that now there's personal responsibility. Somebody in the back had their hand up.
No, I'm looking at motivation. The motivation.
Oh, good one. Yeah. You're finding the motivation. What is on their hearts? Yes. Anything else that self-discovery does?
I think if there's a mistake in play, then they acknowledge
Yes.
what has happened.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, this idea of ownership, I'm acknowledging what's happened.
Understanding.
Yes, what?
Understanding.
Yes, it increases understanding, doesn't it? Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
That's when the story between God, Adam and Eve, I think him asking them was him trying to bring himself to their level.
Uh-huh.
Yes, he knew what they had done.
Ah.
He sort of wanted to still identify
Yes. Yes.
because they did not know him fully,
Uh-huh.
but
Uh-huh.
he knew them fully, but he just wanted to calm down
You know.
to their level,
That's a,
be able to relate with them.
that's a great insight. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that because he's coming down to their level, or another word is he's kind of accommodating to their reality. And part of it is that, and he wants them to acknowledge their reality, right? So they have to own it. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, you give the person the power and choice.
Yes.
Response
Yeah.
the way they want.
Yeah, I hope you're writing these down. This is worth the whole price of the workshop. Yeah, you're giving the person the power and the choice to act. Yes, Paul.
To go back to that, learning about who you are, ultimately, it's bringing us back to know that we need Him. So self-discovery is the pathway to connect us back to God.
Yeah, like
Who we
it's a,
truly are.
yeah, it's a pathway to connect with God. I know you can't read my writing, but also I think we'd say it's a pathway to connect with one another as well. Yeah, and in other words, self-discovery is a pathway to build relationships. Yes.
I also think it creates humility
Uh-huh.
in that when you ask this person, you're trying to tell them that your view is
Okay.
important
Okay. Yeah.
and you're really important to
Yeah.
me. Yeah.
Yeah, your view is important. Yeah, I think a question is, yeah, you're honoring the other person, aren't you? And are recognizing the other person. These are some great, so again, you see the power of self-discovery and what questions can do. Now, we've only just touched on what God is like, and I'm gonna try to capture that later. These are some great insights. So let's move to Jesus. And again, we see in Jesus's ministry that there is over 300 questions that Jesus used. I had a friend of mine that actually documented all those questions. And now again, they're in the four Gospels. Some are repeated, but there's over 300 questions. And so again, let me suggest this. This is a little different slant on this. Again, it's the same thing, right? Jesus, he knew what was in the hearts of men, right? And so he's not asking questions because, I wonder what they're thinking out there. He's not gathering information, but we need to do that because we're not omniscient. But I would suggest that two things that Jesus did, and we mentioned this over here when also Paul mentioned it. When I ask questions, it builds relationships, doesn't it? The right questions build. Now, bad questions can hurt relationships, but good questions can build relationships. So, let me ask you this question. Do I have any more? How can good questions build relationships? How can good questions build relationships?
Gets people to maybe open up in ways that they wouldn't if they weren't asked the question.
Yes, well, like Donnie's discussion yesterday, and being vulnerable and transparent, that people are opening up. Maybe they wouldn't do that, particularly in front of 50 other people, right, Tom? I was asking kind of a vulnerable question. What are anxious moments you're facing this coming week? Now, again, in that triad, we built that level of trust and care, and he'd feel comfortable doing that in a typical setting. But questions help people open up. Other things, how do questions build relationships?
To tag on to what Valerie said, we're not understood. So many times like, oh, I had no idea you were thinking that. It helps me get to know them and where they are on their journey.
Yes.
So many times I'm always surprised by their answers. Like, okay, like I would have never guessed you were thinking that.
Yeah, I had no idea where you were in that journey unless I would have asked the question. Because again, we're not omniscient. We don't know, and we can make false assumptions. Other thoughts on how do questions build relationships? Yes, sir.
Very good questions are not judgmental,
Okay.
and so they open up the space for learning.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, they're not judgmental, so they open people up, for learning. Yeah, excellent. How else
It builds trust.
Ah, very good. Okay, so can I do a follow-up question? And so maybe tell us how would a question build trust, do you think? Because generally we think that sometimes questions can intimidate rather than creating trust. So how do questions build trust? Don't mean to pick on you, but let's just expand that a little bit.
Yeah, I think if you ask like open-ended questions, because you want to know the person more.
Okay, that is it, and I was going to discuss that. So what would be characteristic of an open-ended question?
Okay, I think there was an example that was given me yesterday. That if I ask, how is your dad?
Yes.
It's fine, right?
Yes.
How is your dad doing with this project?
Yes. Yes.
So it begins to open conversation on and on. So naturally, you begin to know the person much more than
Yes.
you know the person.
Yes. Yeah. Very good. I think too, we'll talk about this later. Open-ended questions can be answered by yes or no, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't get me anywhere. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Again, and build on that, the building trust. It communicates to the person that you're actually listening and you care.
Yes. Yeah, I'm listening, so that communicates I care. Yes. Any other thoughts? How do questions build relationships? Over here. Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
I think I'll add on that or trust. It can also build self-esteem. When you ask me what I think instead of you imposing what you think.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm learning your wisdom, I'm inviting your wisdom into this. I see in others' wisdom. We can, and I like the idea too that a good question communicates that the other person's important. It's a sign of respect for the other person. And let me suggest a second reason why Jesus asked questions is he wanted to encourage people's thinking. See, again, just think of those analogies. The kingdom of heaven is like, and we got a variety of ways he could fill that in. And he doesn't give a one-sentence definition, does he? Like, let's just take those analogies. Something is like something else. It's an analogy. Kingdom of heaven is like. If you ever looked at the parables, there's no mention of God in any of the parables. There's no mention of faith in any of the parables. But the kingdom of heaven, and he paints these pictures. They're like these things. So what does that force us to do? We've got to think about it. We've got to stop. Wow, what's he mean by that? So how can questions encourage thinking? Well, let me ask this question first. Okay, why is thinking important? Why is thinking in the Christian life important? You got a sermon on this? Go ahead. My friend back here has thought about this a lot. Yes.
Yeah, it helps you to think over what God says. in His Word, derive, and then derive an application in your own situation.
Yeah. Yeah, so I want to think about what is it that God has said in His Word, and that comes down to application. But and so this is critical. Why else is thinking important, particularly as we think about disciple making? Yes, sir.
It's a form of worship.
Okay, tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that.
We are not called to worship God with all our hearts and all our minds. So when we apply ourselves to learn and to think, we're looking at our minds to God in worship.
Yes, yeah. We're worshiping with all of our hearts, all of our minds. And so thinking can become is an element of worship. Yes. It's not something to be afraid of. And other thoughts, why is just thinking so important in disciple making?
It will provide an avenue to explore the strength and the weaknesses.
Okay, it provides an avenue to explore person's own strengths and weaknesses. But and I love your phrase here, it provides an avenue to explore. And so that, like our coming to Kenya, so as we've mentioned with friends, that this is the first time Peggy and I have ever been to Africa. And so this is kind of a learning experience to us. It's kind of like it's an avenue for us to explore, meet new people, experience new foods, new places. And so it's causing us to think about some things. And other things, why is just thinking so important?
It helps us to it helps us to sort of see the areas where we have perceptions that don't align with God's word.
Yes.
So you discover how you see things and where they're not aligned with.
Very good. Yeah. So I make some discoveries where I may be either out of a line or in a line with God's word. Yes. Yes, got a bunch of people back here. Yeah, whole fun. Yes.
I think when you after thinking and processing in your mind, it usually goes to the heart.
Ah, okay. Yes. As you think and process, ultimately goes to your heart. Well, I had a bunch of hands up here. Yes, ma'am.
Really, this is what
Yes.
I've learned from coaching.
Okay.
When I'm asking these questions,
Yes.
I'm aware that the Holy Spirit is in our presence.
Okay.
So when I'm thinking, because even whoever is asking the questions is also thinking,
Yes.
and whoever he's receiving to answer, they're also thinking. So it's like whatever I've been hearing, I'm bringing it. The Lord is bringing it in a personal way to my situation.
Yes.
So that it stops being general.
Okay.
So it is a lot that I've heard and been taught, but now I'm letting God just crystallize that for myself and my situation.
Yes.
So it's a growth area.
Yes.
In also listening to the Spirit of God.
Yes.
For myself.
Yes. Yeah, and so thinking, boy, that's a lot there. I'm trying to capture that for us. That thinking takes place in this conversation that I'm having with another person. And then that the Spirit of God uses it to reveal things to me and to the other person. Yes. Excuse me?
To get this both of you.
Yes, to get that point of view, yeah. And also, as we've talked too, is that we discover my point of view. Gentleman in the back, yes, sir.
It's also important for comparison.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that last part.
Thinking is important for comparison.
Oh, for comparison, yeah, very good. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And ma'am, you had a back comparison. And yes, ma'am.
Decision making helps in decision making.
Yes, and decision making. Because some decisions aren't black and white, are they? And I've got to wrestle with what's the wise thing to do. And so I've got to think about that. Anybody, this is really good. Yes, ma'am.
It helps in building convictions.
It builds convictions. Okay, now, because, This is fun. Let's take, what is characteristic of a conviction? We would all know that those are important. What if you had to describe something I've got a conviction on? What does that mean for you? Yes. Excuse me? Yes. Well, I would suggest it might be deep because again, the root word here is to convince, right? And so conviction, I would suggest I'm really convinced of this. And some people would say conviction, these are the things I might die for. These are the things that are the priorities. They're important in my life. And I can't pass on my convictions to my disciples. I want to encourage them, but they need to own it. Right? And so discovery, helping them to think, helps them to own it. It's theirs. And by the way, I think sometimes in disciple making, we have to be careful that, and it's my friend back here, as we start with the scriptures, and that is a means by which they're developing convictions. We're not passing on our convictions, because sometimes there is a difference between a conviction and a preference. I prefer that we dress a certain way. I prefer a different type of music. I prefer, this is things we do in art. See what I'm saying? And we have these strong preferences. And sometimes the preferences can be, we confuse them with convictions. And so that we want to be about building convictions, and we help people think that can begin to happen. This is really great. And so that, again, questions help encourage thinking, and all these things can begin to take place. See the power of questions here? So from our discussion so far, that, what's standing out to you about the importance of questions and self-discovery? Let's kind of equate the two for a minute. But from our discussion so far, and we've talked here for quite a while, what's been a standout thought for you about the importance of questions and self-discovery? Let's try to capture our learning here a little bit. Yeah, just real quick, all that we've talked about. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think it takes you to a better part of planning.
Okay, yeah. I'm gonna give you a tool to help you in that planning here in a minute. Yeah, but there's work on my part to ask questions. They're hard. It's hard. Question asking is a skill. Like anything else, from our discussion, here's a takeaway. This is some wisdom I've gleaned from this time.
Build hope in someone's life.
Excuse me now?
Build hope.
Oh, build hope, yes.
I'm learning that asking questions is the basic. If I don't ask questions, I won't get to learn.
Yeah, if I don't ask questions, I'm not going to get into a person's life and a variety of other things.
So we have been thinking just like we started self-discovery, how good questions affects relationships,
Yes.
then about thinking. I'm just thinking about when you ask a good question, it will lead someone to discover and to own something.
Yes.
Then when it comes to thinking, just like someone said that thinking, again, it goes back to the heart.
Yes.
And we know that from the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks.
Okay, yes.
Meaning all these like questions will lead us, will affect our actions.
Yes.
How we live lives outside.
Yes. Let me illustrate it in this way, that when you ask questions, if they're done right, it reveals what's on their hearts.
Yeah.
And so that we discover what's on people's hearts, and then we can begin to encourage them towards the scriptures and towards, the issue of alignment. We talked about that. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's a better way of helping people to communicate their faith with courage. Yeah, and with passion.
Yes.
Because they're not just telling people what others have told them.
Yes.
They're telling people what they have thought about and they have processed it. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, courage. And again, I like to suggest convictions are the things that we're courageous about, we're passionate about. And so self-discovery helps build these in. You know, again, under the guidance and help of the Holy Spirit helps to build that in. this is a great discussion. We could go on, but let me try to land the plane a little bit and give you it's in your notes there. There's one thing that is in your notes. I call it the question asking triangle. Okay? And so that in terms of asking questions, to me, what's foundational, and we've touched on this, is there has to be trust between us, right? With the person. And that I can ask, basic questions, but if there's no trust, I can't go any deeper. And so when we put the other side of the triangle, there are different types of questions, aren't there? And I can ask you a question that, what do you think of these trees that are planted here? What do you think of these flowers? And that's kind of an open-ended question. We could talk about that. And then I could ask a question, to you, what makes something beautiful in one's life? Now I'm getting a little more personal, aren't I, in it? And so there are different types of questions we can ask, and we're going to explore that in just a minute. But the more personal the question is related to the greater the trust in the relationship, in most cases. And sometimes that takes time to be able to do that. But we also know there are sometimes you just kind of really hit it with the person right away. You just immediately connect with somebody, and you can begin to ask personal questions. But generally, trust has to be built. The greater the trust, the more personal the question. And then the other element, and we've all experienced this, is timing. There's a Holy Spirit sense of timing in asking questions, isn't there? And you've probably seen it in your own personal life that, at that moment, they really asked me the right question. Or when you were talking with somebody else, coaching someone else, you discover, wow, this question at the right time opens something up in a person's life. And we can be sensitive to that, and we want to be sensitive to the Holy Spirit and trusting for the right timing to ask a question. When we have guests to our house, for whatever reason, generally as they're going out the door and they're leaving, I'll ask them one last question. And Peggy will always get on me and says, they're leaving. Why are you asking another question? The timing, sometimes my timing is off. So in asking questions are built on the trust we have with the person. There are different types of questions. And then we really need to be sensitive to timing. Now, one last thing, and then I'm going to show you an illustration. I had a lunch with a friend a couple of weeks ago, and he had been in our collegiate ministry back in the 1980s, and now, Jim his kids are in college, and, it's been a long time since the 1980s. And he says that one of the things I appreciate about what we did in our college ministry is you ask questions. He said, but what I've been teaching my kids, not only is the important question, he says that what I tell them is that the most important question is the second one. Because he says it's like this, I sit down with my sister and she says, how's the job going? I said, it's going great. How are the kids doing? Oh, they're doing great. How's it going with Lisa? Oh, it's going great. So what happened? There was no second question. So it says, if your job's going great, the second question about, tell me a little about what's happening on the job that makes it so great. You see what I'm saying? It's a second question. The second question tells me whether I'm listening or not, right? And also the second question tells me that I respect you, I want to honor you, and I want to get to know you a little deeper. So I'll ask a second question. So, like with Jacob here, he tossed it with a statement out, I forget what it was now, about trust, I think. And so I asked him, tell me a little bit more. Okay? That was the second question that draws out a little bit more from him on what trust is. All right. Now, let me give you a tool for question asking. Yes, sir.
Questions and trust. You know that trust is built over time.
Yes.
And yet when I meet someone we have just met, I need to still ask questions.
Yes.
How do you reconcile that?
How
do you get a breakthrough?
Yes. Well, I can give you an illustration.
Somebody doesn't trust you, doesn't even know you.
Right. Yes. Well, I'll give an example here of meeting a lot of you. Is that this first time? You don't know me now. You're very trusting people, but yeah, usually first question I've asked all of you is we're meeting. Well, where are you from? Okay, oh, I'm from Uganda. And I brought my map of Africa with me. It'll point out, and then, well, what do you do in Uganda? You in here's another way to think about it. A lot of times that if I'm just initially meeting somebody, I'm asking questions just to gain information. Where do you live? What do you do? And then I might ask you, well, tell me something about your town, about where you live. See, now I've discovered where you live. Tell me about Uganda. What's it like living in Uganda? See, that's not personal yet. Or that if they tell me, and I think I've asked this to some of you, okay, I'm on Navigator staff. Well, how did you meet the navigators? See what I'm saying? So they're not really deeply personal questions. In a sense, I'm just collecting information from you. And by the way, when we collect information, we end up finding we have some common ground. Like almost with all of you, our common ground is the navigators. And we find some common ground, and that common ground then builds trust. You think, oh, hey, they maybe experienced this, they know this. See what I'm saying? We've discovered that's another thing that questions do, is they help us to discover common ground, things we share in common together. And that builds that element of trust. Does that help?
So yes, it
Yes.
helps. So that means that that statement that the most important question is the second one. The second one might come a little bit because you're asking questions about information.
Yes.
Information.
Yeah. Yeah, but like you tell me, well, I'm from Uganda. My second question is, well, where in Uganda? And that's when I pull my map out. And I might ask, well, tell me a little bit about your town that you live in, or the village you live in. See, again, it's not really personal yet. I'm just collecting information. But you see, I've asked them, I'm from Uganda, where? Tell me about your town. Maybe then, hey, do you have children? What are your children's names? See, so I'm asking these questions that I'm just, in a sense, collecting information from you. And maybe we'll build trust, but probably not. But hey, if we were to meet more often, trust would be built over time. So I could then ask more personal questions. This is a very good illustration. Yes, sir.
Yeah, we talk about the fact that good question builds relationship.
Yes.
Now I'm thinking about how we handle the response that comes.
Yes.
I don't know whether you're going to handle that.
Okay, like, tell me.
How do we help people? How do I help someone to know that he or she is right? Because
Okay.
that also
Okay.
can be dangerous.
Yes. Yes. Let me.
Can you repeat?
Yes. In other words, when you're asking questions and they respond, and suppose they respond in a way that you think, I'm not sure that's right. How do I then follow up on that? And let me see if this little tool I handed out to you can help in doing that. Because again, it comes down to the type of question and the timing of the question. And so let me see if this little tool will help. So let me try to step back for a minute. What we're saying is that discovery is really key in disciple making, and that when people discover things, they own them, they have convictions. A great tool to promote self-discovery is asking questions. We see how God asked questions, Jesus asked questions, and the questions were asked not to gather information for themselves. So the questions are really for the hearer, the recipient of the question. And the questions then help us to think deeply, and they help us to build relationships. And in a discipling context, in a teaching context, it's helping to build conviction. Okay? So this is where we are. And so that on the idea of a type of question, the piece I just handed out to you, does everybody have a copy now of this? I call it the question ladder. And by the way, you can download this from my website, alongsider.com. That's alongsider.com. And I got a lot of free resources. By the way, is it 10:30, Andrew? For the break? Pardon?
10:21.
Okay, well, that's fine. We're going to have time to practice in a little bit. Okay, so this is what's called the question ladder. And like in any ladder, you start at the bottom rungs and you walk up. But so this is not so much questions that you can use those in everyday relationships, but these are more discipleship questions, okay? And so they may not be the question that I'm going to sit down and talk with somebody over lunch today, but if I'm meeting with somebody one-to-one, or I use this in small groups, these are more discipleship questions, okay? And so I build it around this little, is it an acrostic or an acronym? I always get it mixed up. But so L, that's the lower rung, okay, is that I just want to listen to what this person knows, And then, so that's the L, I'm listening to what they know. E is emotions. I'm looking at their motives, their emotions, what motivates them. A is, here we ask about the Bible. What does the Bible say? R is, we're reaching deep. Now we're getting past, these are questions to analyze. Somebody said to compare. We're asking the question out, kind of analyzing. So we're going a little bit deeper here in some ways. And then the N in learn is to now act. What is God asking me to do? So that's the application part, which we've talked about a lot, that a lot of times the application, the change, the behavior, whatever it might be, helps me to know if I've learned something or not. And so on the reverse side of the card are some examples of questions that you can ask. What do I listen to? What I want to know? Emotions, asking about the Bible, then reach deep for understanding. So I'm going to put, and I meant Tom to ask you this. Can you come up and we'll role play this for a minute? Well, so suppose that Tom and I are meeting, we're in a triad together, and he says, I've got some real questions about prayer. And so, let's get together at some point and talk about prayer, kind of one-to-one. And so this could be an illustration of how it might go. Now, realize it's artificial. It's, only doing it for 5 minutes. And so I may make some mistakes, but we'll just observe this. And so Tom, I appreciate you bringing that out about prayer. So, tell me when you think of prayer and praying to God, I guess what comes to mind for you?
Well, I guess what comes to mind is does he really hear?
Okay.
Are my prayers just hitting the ceiling?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, the hit, yes. And so how does that make you feel if that's how you think about prayer?
Just, like I'm not really connecting with God.
Yeah. So that, do you get does that discourage you, or does that,
Yeah, because I'd like that kind of fellowship that I've heard you have with God. Inspired me in that way. I just, I don't know. When I'm actually praying, I don't know if I'm connecting with God like you do.
Yeah. I guess so what do you think could inspire you to, not to be like me, but would inspire you to pray?
Well, I think I have the motivation. Maybe I'm just praying wrong.
Okay.
I want to pray. I want that connection with God.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there's a passage in the Bible where Jesus actually instructs us how to pray. And he says, well, when you pray, pray like this. And you probably know it. You may even repeat it in church. It's called the Lord's Prayer.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And so think, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And so let's just look at the first verse where he says, our Father who art in heaven. And so that when he uses that term Father, what does that bring to mind for you?
Someone who is caring and providing and loving.
Yeah. And so how could that, if our Heavenly Father is like that, how could that affect your prayer life?
Well, it gives me confidence, just the name Father, that he does hear me.
Yeah.
He wants to hear from me.
Yes. Yeah, they're good fathers do that, don't they? Yeah. But what's the next line? What's Jesus that says, our Father, and what does he say next? I know you've memorized.
Hallowed be your name.
Yeah, well, no, where is the Father?
In heaven.
Yeah, and so if the Father is in heaven, again, how does that affect? Why do you think Jesus tossed that in when he's teaching about prayer?
I don't know. I feel like it doesn't help me because now I think of him as far away.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, but what did Jesus first start saying about the Father?
Yeah, so he's close like a father.
Yes.
So I don't have to think about him being in heaven as something I can't connect to.
Yes, it's something that can, but he is,
He's different.
but he is different from me, yes, yeah, he's both close to me, and yet, but by being different and in heaven, in a sense, how does that help us in our prayer life? We can feel he's distant, but Jesus said he's close.
Yeah.
But then he throws in, but he's in heaven. How can that help us as we think about prayer?
Well, I guess that when we talk to God, we realize he's God.
Yes.
And that should bring a certain weight to the experience.
Yeah.
But he's also my Father.
Yes. Yes.
And
yeah.
so I can go to him with concerns and needs.
Yeah. Yeah. So he's close as a father. But the other thing I've often thought, if he's in heaven, that's a sign of kind of authority and power too, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so we pray that he has the authority and power to help me. And well, this is this picture kind of, and we could spend time talking through this whole passage, but just the idea, our Father who is in heaven, what helps you to, in a sense, bridge that gap between God being close to me and yet him being in heaven? How does kind of those two things, how those two ways that the Father is, how can that help me in praying?
Well, it makes me not want to rush into prayer. Like,
Okay.
I don't know, sometimes I hear people just say, well, let's pray. God, Father, God.
Yeah.
And I think, wow, he's like a powerful God in heaven.
Yes.
But after maybe just getting myself ready to pray, then I realize not only is he great and awesome, but I'm looking forward to talking to my Father.
That's a great statement. I'm looking forward to talking to him. Yeah, he's both personal, but he's great and awesome. Yeah, and so, well, as you think about, say, in the next 24 hours, think about your schedule. And so that in our little discussion here on prayer, how could what we've talked about, looking at this passage in the Sermon on the Mount, how could it affect your prayer life just in the next 24 hours?
I think out of everything you said, just the start, the Father, our Father, has helped me a lot.
Yes, yeah.
Because, like I said, I just had this sense of, is anyone really listening?
Yes.
And the fact that he taught us to pray, and then he started out with our Father. It's really been helpful. So, we'll see what my prayer experience is like this week. But I really expect it's going to be better.
Yes. Yeah. Well, what would you like to see God do by now focusing on him as my Father in heaven?
I think just having, not being inhibited by my doubts, but just moving forward and talking to my Father regularly and enjoying that. That's what I'd like to see.
Okay. Yeah, so it's kind of removing my doubts, drawing them closer to him. Yeah, hey, there is somebody that's hearing that. And well, listen, when we get together, maybe next week, let's talk about what you've discovered about addressing God as Father and how that's helping you in your prayer life.
Fantastic.
All right.
Thanks, Bill.
Now again, these things are always they're always a little artificial and so on, but I guess what observations can you make about what took place just now? And hey, again, he's a pretty easy guy to talk to. But he raised a good question in the middle of it, didn't he? Yes. And which is a natural question. But again, what did you observe about what took place here? Pardon? Yeah. He got a solution to his issue. Yeah. And this is I guess what I'm thinking question. Yes. Man.
He also, when you were going through the passage, and you were going through our Father who art in heaven, and the first perception was God in heaven is so far from me.
Yes.
So therefore he's not listening to my prayers, my prayers out.
Yes.
But then the questions that you asked after helped him to sort of move from seeing it that way to seeing God as he's in heaven, so he's this powerful authority, figure who when I pray to him, he hears and he can answer.
Yes.
So moving from a wrong way of perceiving God, so that journey.
Yes. Yeah, very good. And that's the question, the concern back here is that they come out with the wrong answers. If you notice, I directed them back to the passage again. So what's the passage say? It's our Father who is also in heaven. And so again, we direct people back to the passage. And I'm not telling them you're wrong, but let's look at the passage again and begin to explore what the passage says. And so he can then make the assessments according to what the passage says. And we can then get more personal. Well, we're going to break here in just a minute, right? And so let me try to summarize. And first of all, on this little tool, a lot of times how I use this is that if I'm meeting one-to-one with somebody, and asking questions is like any skill, right? You know, probably all of us here know how to ride a bicycle. And you think about the first time you ever rode a bicycle and probably how you fell over. And it's been fun. I'm seeing my son and daughter-in-law teach the little boys how to ride a bicycle. And we put the bicycles together at Christmas. You know how all that goes. But you first got to it's just a skill. And so you just practice it. And so what I found as I'm practicing it, that if I'm meeting with someone one-to-one, say, and I want to ask some questions, I'll write the questions down ahead of time. And I may put them on a 3x5 card or a little piece of paper. And a lot of times I'll say to the person, well, I've been thinking about our conversation, and this is so important to me that I've written some questions that I thought we could talk about. And if you don't mind, I'd like to pull the questions out, until you get better at asking questions. So I don't think there's anything wrong in writing them down and saying to the other person, if I got a good relationship with them, I really wanted to ask you some good questions, and I forget things. And so I wrote some things down. Or you could take this and apply it to leading a small group discussion. And in that case, I'll take this and I'll identify some questions and I'll write them in the margins. So say if we're using a book like Every Man a Warrior or the 2-7 or whatever it might be, I'll write the questions in the margin that I'd like to ask them. And so that on either way, isn't the only way, but this is a way of putting in a kind of an acronym. These are the different types of questions and if you notice, it's meant to move you from the basic stuff, what does a person know, getting at their emotions, getting at their heart, getting into the scriptures, helping them analyze things, and then the application. In some ways, the application can be the most personal thing, right? So what I've tried to do in this time together is that we started out with my dog named Ginger. And Ginger, even though I taught her, she never really learned how to whistle. And so that we want to encourage learning in people's lives, and learning being that there's a change of life, change of pattern, change of behavior. But most of all, people own something. This is not mine. This is my conviction. And one way, it's not the only way, but one way is through discovery. And a key point of discovery is asking questions. And so how do we ask questions? We need to discern, questions are built on the trust we have. There's different types of questions. And there's a timing for when we ask questions. And sometimes the most important question is the second one. And so as we think then of engaging people in self-discovery, it's a little bit like climbing a ladder, right? Going up this ladder. We want to learn what they know. We want to get at their emotions. We want to look at the Bible. Want to, go a little deeper, and then we want to, move towards an application. All of that's done in a context. If it's a healthy church, what I like to suggest is that, remember Jesus' teaching ministry here? That, hey, they're getting good, solid instruction, but we need to have the other side of that seesaw at play, which is where we come into work. And so that we want to encourage self-discovery, because self-discovery leads to true learning, deep learning, and leads to conviction. All right, with that in mind, I guess we're ready for break and taking tea. And I got there, and then Tom will come up and lead us in a discussion on application accountability. And then we want to provide some time then for sharing about the GIDC process.